kick off? What do you think? You feeling ready to go? Okay.
Yes, that's good.
Over to you.
Wominjika, thank you all so much for arriving to this PD session today. Just before we get into it, I'd just like to let you guys know that we're actually recording this session because we had a few teachers who really wanted to arrive, but unfortunately had other commitments. As I'm sure you've all been incredibly busy during this period of lockdown, so we are going to be recording it for the purposes of the presentation. If you wouldn't mind keeping your microphones on mute, and at least until the end, until the Q&A part of it, that would be really helpful. You can set your own view at the top of the menu if you want to change what you can see. We've got a couple of people who are going to be monitoring and moderating the chat box, so if you've got any questions, if you want to put them in the chat box, that would be awesome. And as part of that, if you can address them to everybody, just so we don't have the same questions coming through. And we will be able to answer some of the questions about the text once we get to the end. So any questions about pricing or availability and all that sorts of things, we'll get through then. So without further ado, let's get started. So before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, who are the owners of the unceded lands where this presentation is being made. I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and any other Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people engaging with this presentation. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and waters where this presentation is being observed. And there is a content warning that for any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander viewers, there are images of Indigenous people in this presentation who are now deceased. I'm not going to speak too much for too long about this slide, but this is basically an introductory slide to Matilda Education, and talks a little bit about the project that we've been working on together for the last few months. It is very, very exciting to be a part of this publishing company, especially to be part of one that is working in this space specifically for the benefit of Australian teachers. That's something that I think is really, really valuable, especially when it comes to engaging with the Australian and Victorian curricula. So today I've only got a half an hour, so I'm going to have to work very hard to condense quite a bit into a very short amount of time. So I'll start off with a little bit about myself, a little bit about my role with Matilda, a brief introduction to Indigenous education. We're going to talk about busting some myths and some tips and tricks to help you, of course, engage with First Nations content with confidence. So a little bit about myself. I am a proud descendant of the Dja Dja Wurrung people from Central Victoria. My family story is my Aboriginal ancestors have lived in this place for tens of thousands of years. I had ancestors who arrived in the 1850s from various places in Europe, including Ireland, Great Britain and Switzerland. The surname Fricker actually means from the village of Frick. When they arrived, they moved into Central Victoria, where one of my ancestors, my European ancestors, had a relationship with a woman by the name of Mary Menine, who was documented at the Franklin Ford mission in the 1840s. They had a child together and lived at a place called Chinaman's Flat, which of course is now no longer there. And after one generation, moved to Melbourne, where they essentially rebranded themselves from being Aboriginal, which would have meant that they would have been at risk of child removal, lack of education, lack of employment opportunities, welfare. And so they rebranded themselves as Black Irish. And that was the story that went through the family for many generations. So I've grown up off country. I've grown up largely separated from my Aboriginal community. I don't know any of my Aboriginal language. And these are all things that many students, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, will be living with as they are navigating their own places within their cultural identity and heritage. I'm a former primary and secondary school teacher. I did that for about 3.5 years. and I'm currently finishing off a PhD and am working at RMIT University as a lecturer specialising in Indigenous education. So my role at Matilda Education is as primarily as an editor and reviewer and cultural advisor, and I've been working on this project since August last year. My main role has been to work with authors to ensure that the text has been adjusted for accuracy and cultural appropriateness. And also my role is about essentially vetting it to ensure that you as teachers can pick up this textbook and you can go through it activity by activity, page by page, with confidence to know that it has been edited in consultation with myself and of course others who I consult with through the Aboriginal community in Victoria as well. And that moves us away from a phenomenon that we've noted over the past few years, especially since the cross-curriculum priority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures was established with the Australian curriculum and then of course the Victorian curriculum. A lot of teachers, although meaning well and wanting to do well in this space, not really sure where to begin. So there's a lot of anxious hand-wringing that goes on, and then unfortunately very little actually happens in that space. So this is a really lovely foundation, stepping off point to begin to engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content. So to give you a bit of context, over the many years in Australia since the colonisation began, there have been specific policies that have dictated how Aboriginal education, so the education of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, but more broadly the education about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture has been delivered in Australia. Now, my current research on my PhD is actually exploring specifically how it is still occurring today in many schools around the country. And what we do know is that First Nations students are not being adequately supported in schools. We see that every year with the NAPLAN results that come out, the standardised testing. There are clear gaps in some areas up to 2 years between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. And there are many, many different reasons for this, all of which come from colonisation and of course the resulting genocide, which is still actually happening today. But in addition to the gaps that are occurring between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, what we're also finding is that non-Indigenous students are actually missing out on some really, really important content as well. And this is largely due to a phenomenon which was articulated by a guy called Bill Stanner, who was an Australian anthropologist back in the 1960s, and he dubbed it the Great Australian Silence. And his research examined how Australian history books had been written post-federation, and he discovered that because Australia federated and became a nation state without any significant conflicts or wars of independence or civil wars or anything like that, it was just a whole bunch of old white men in a room signing a document, that there was a requirement for a colonial narrative to be generated to create some sort of national identity. And so in doing so, and in the context of what was then Australian foreign policy, which was the White Australia policy, the Great Australian Silence created a colonial narrative of Australian history which wrote out anybody who wasn't of Anglo descent in the country. So in addition to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that were written out of Australian history, so too were Chinese migrants who came for the gold rush, the Afghani cavaliers who used to work the trade routes through the Central Deserts, and of course the South Sea Islanders who were kidnapped and brought to Australia as slave labour in the sugar plantations. Now, what we know is that this Great Australian Silence has been something that has been pervasive throughout every single iteration of the various curricula of states and the Australian curriculum ever since, and is a key part of the discussions or attempted discussions that we seek to have around national identity in Australian history in contemporary Australia. And these are often issues around culture wars and a lot of contention between competing historical ideas. Now, of course, in addition to the Great Australian Silence, what we also have that has shaped a lot of the content delivered about Aboriginal people is this concept of othering. And that is a concept which was articulated by a guy called Edward Said in his book Orientalism. And he discussed how many universities in Europe had created schools of Oriental studies where European people would travel to Eastern nations or the Far East, or wouldn't even get there. And as experts in the field would then start to define how those people are actually living. And of course, in doing so, would judge them based on their own ideas of what was culture, what was technology, what was advancement, what was civilization, and would often describe alternative cultures as being primitive and less than and no good. And that would often justify some of the pretty horrific things which happened around global colonization and genocide that we've been seeing for the past 400 or so years. Now, in the Australian context, othering is really important because early on, there's this racialized science which basically tries to position Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the missing link between primates and humans. And so there's a whole lot of non-Indigenous anthropologists who go into Indigenous communities and start othering them to perpetuate myths around Stone Age, being violent, being childlike and incapable of being able to consider higher order thought. And so this also shapes education policy because for decades, for over a century, Aboriginal children are not allowed to access an education greater than a grade 3 level because the boys are trained to become manual labourers and the girls are trained to become domestic labourers. So already we see for decades a real difference between the levels of education that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students can actually access. Now, of course, getting back to a combination of the silence and othering, this means that as a nation, the history curriculum has sought to create and perpetuate myths and falsehoods which are designed to inculcate all children into a colonial nationalistic ideal. One only needs to look further than looking at what happened during the John Howard government, where they released the infamous poster that had Simpson and his donkey on it and talked about Australian values, and that was actually linked to school funding. So if your school didn't display the poster in a prominent area, it would be at risk of having its funding stripped. And this poster was specifically designed to inculcate the children into what are Australian values. Now, of course, as an extension of this educational inequality, of this perpetuation of myths and falsehoods, which we'll get into a little bit later, this is a factor in entrenching further social inequalities in Australia, and these manifest in some pretty important ways. We know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students are less likely to finish school. We know that once they do finish school, they're less likely to have access to the same sorts of opportunities for further education or employment. There are issues around coming into contact with the judicial system. And of course, we know that there are huge links between level of education and overall health. And we know that the life expectancy in this country for Aboriginal people is much, much less than non-Indigenous people. And so I suppose this in many ways is the why, answering the question, why are we doing this and why is this an important thing? So let's bust a few myths. So myth number one, Captain Cook did not discover Australia at all. Australia had been well and truly discovered by all the people already living here. Beyond that, it had also been discovered by numerous other international powers prior to the British arriving here. I mean, it's a dead giveaway that Australia, the continent itself, was named New Holland before the British got here. So that would indicate, to my mind, that the Dutch had at least arrived before. There's some evidence which suggests that the Portuguese and the Spaniards arrived. We know the Macassans were trading through with the Yolngu people for a century or two before the Europeans arrived. So we need to think about how we talk about the first Europeans to arrive and to stay in Australia. And so as part of this book, we've worked really hard to update the language. Aboriginal people were not nomads. This is a very common myth. To be a nomad, it implies an aimless wandering. But what we know is that Aboriginal people have had and always have had a really solid scientific understanding of country and a connection to country. So what would happen is Aboriginal people would be seasonal migrants. They would stay in a place for a particular length of time, and then once the time was right, they would move to another place and allow that land to regenerate. For some, it was around the spawning season or migration patterns of various bird life or animal life. The Aboriginal people were not Stone Age, because Stone Age is quite a pejorative term, and what it implies is a level of sort of a lack of development. But what we do know is, for starters, there are Aboriginal communities who were using metals and steel, which they would trade for from the Macassans and other traders that would arrive. But we also know that being Stone Age doesn't actually have any connection to technological or cultural advancement. And so in many ways, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have lived more scientifically advanced than contemporary Australian society, because we lived here for tens of thousands of years in harmony and in sustainable ways with country. And that's something that hasn't happened for the 230 odd years that Europeans have been here. Some other key language is Australia was invaded, it was colonized, and there was a genocide, and there still is a genocide happening. Remove settled from your vocabulary, all right, because it is factually incorrect. To settle somewhere implies a peaceful occupation. But what we know from the wealth of evidence is that it was anything but. There was the frontier wars and the violence. There was the sexual violence. There was this spreading, the intentional spreading of disease. And there was the marginalisation and the removal of Aboriginal people to the periphery of society. Aboriginal people were not dull-witted. We were the first bakers. We were the first navigators. We were the first astronomers. We were the first scientists. We have had, and we still have, knowledge that is tens of thousands of years old, which people, non-Indigenous people, are only starting to realise is actually really quite spot on. And there's some really interesting stories of Aboriginal knowledge which details specific astrological or geological events that geologists and astronomers are only just starting to discover today. We know that Aboriginal people engaged in agriculture and aquaculture and did this in sustainable ways for tens of thousands of years. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do have a special relationship with country. And that's something that also needs to be acknowledged, especially around issues around land rights. And in this image, of course, is from down near Budge Beam in the Western Districts, which is actually showing the foundations of some of the permanent dwellings that were there. So let's talk about some tips and tricks. So if you want to be engaging with this, I suppose at a minimum, this textbook is going to be a really fantastic resource, because a lot of this stuff, the research has been done, First Nations sources and voices have been sought, the content is appropriate and it is accurate. I'm sorry, there's somebody who's got their mic on. If you wouldn't mind switching that off, that'd be awesome. And we have opportunities, have used our time to create opportunities to update the text. It's not perfect, because even within the Australian curriculum and the Victorian curriculum, there are significant issues and tensions that will need to be addressed. And so what we're viewing this as is a stepping stone to a better future for engaging with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content. So this is most certainly not the end point, but is definitely something that we're going to be seeking to build on over the next few years. But in terms of your own professional practice, some tips and tricks to consider is seek First Nations sources and voices. Avoid the risk of accessing a non-Indigenous text or knowledge that seeks to other Aboriginal people and perpetuate these myths and ideas about them. And seek it from, I suppose, the proverbial horse's mouth, because we have organisations that have been specifically created to support teachers in this space. Do your research. It sounds like a really simple thing to do, but Google is your best friend. There's a whole bunch of stuff on Google that you can engage with. There's a whole lot of online resources. There's heaps of stuff in this textbook. And there's heaps of opportunities to engage with research should you go down that path. Wherever possible, connect with your local land council or Indigenous education bodies. So there are 28 groups in Victoria. So not every group is going to be Wurundjeri, although that's where many schools are. But wherever your school is located, ensure that you're connecting with the local people of that area, because that is the appropriate thing to do. And again, a Google search will help you find that out. And of course, I've got a link at the end to Victorian Aboriginal education body who will be able to direct you as well to your specific areas. Something to consider is how you're positioning Aboriginal culture, peoples and histories in the language that you're using in the class. So what we want to avoid is deficit positioning. We want to avoid exclusionary statements like them and us. We want to be able to position Aboriginal cultures and histories and people as another part of Australian identity. So it's not about seeking to see the differences, although there are some important ones that we should learn about, but also seeking to find similarities. One example that I use with my students is when we look at Indigenous family structures, there are many contexts where families will have uncles and aunties that are biological uncles and aunties that will also be mum and dad. And a lot of students go, oh, that's really interesting. It's so different. And then the example I give is, well, how many of your parents' friends who you're not blood related to do you refer to as uncle or auntie so-and-so? And so what we seek to do there is start to highlight the similarities between different ways of viewing the world. When in doubt, ask. If you're not sure, rather than wringing the hands and hopping from foot to foot and not engaging with the topic, start finding about it. Ask, contact your local groups, do some professional reading. It's really important. A great start is a book by Bruce Pascoe called Dark Emu. It is easily, hands down, one of the best books to start thinking about the content and this topic in a really nuanced, interesting and deep way. It's really important to cover First Nations content consistently throughout the school year. It's really hard the way that the curriculum has been constructed, because it says a defined learning area, you do it, you tick it, you flick it, and then you're on to the next one. But something to consider is that one of the issues we have is this idea of tokenism. And to avoid tokenism, two key things must be addressed is authenticity and also consistency. Now, of course, despite the limitations within the curriculum, because we have this cross-curriculum priority, it then actually gives you the green light to insert it wherever you think it should fit. And if there are some questions around the suitability of that, it's about highlighting it as a cross-curriculum priority. And so that is a tension within the curriculum itself, which actually gives us a fair bit of discretion in this space as well. And then finally, the big comment here is to brown your content. When we start to brown our content, what we're actually doing is prioritising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices, resources, content, and pedagogies. I don't really have the time to go through it in great depth, but I've written a little bit about it in a paper that I've got as a reference at the end of the presentation. And so you can have a read of that at your leisure. So when it comes to teaching First Nations content with confidence, you've got to understand that this is a political act. I originally just had the Daily Telegraph front page from a couple of years ago with our outrage that a university had just described Captain Cook's arrival as an invasion. But more recently, we had the Deputy Health, I'm having a mind blank, from Victoria, who tweeted about it. And then, of course, a lot of the Conservative MPs have come out and started hammering her for having that view, which is factually correct. There is absolutely no other changes that need to be made to that. It is pretty much spot on. So as teachers, you are a political body. You are going to find yourselves as part of a culture war, and you need to be able to back yourself. We also need to consider that knowing and understanding First Nations cultures is a key part of establishing a national identity that is inclusive for all Australians. And when we start including First Nations cultures within the Australian identity, we then start to be able to engage with some really important questions around what is the purpose of Australia Day and should we still have it? To support your own practice in this space, community engagement and partnerships are key. You need to get Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people into your schools. You need to pay them for their time, and you need to be able to access and share with your students some really important information that they have. And I guarantee you there are educators and elders sitting by the phone waiting for your call. There are a growing number of professional development sessions and online resources that you can access, and a simple Google search will provide you plenty of that. And there are a lot of really, really good operators who are starting to get businesses together running professional development sessions to support teachers working in this space. And of course, finally, this text has specifically been designed for you to be able to pick it up and teach it with confidence. So a lot of those tips and tricks have already been incorporated into the text. It's been vetted by myself and other people I've spoken to through the community. And so you can use this with confidence with your students as well. I'm going for time. Oh, I've got a couple more minutes, so this is good. So today, this session, I've shared a little bit about myself, a little bit about my history, talked a little bit about my role with Matilda. I've given you a very, very brief introduction to some of the issues and historical context around Indigenous education. I've busted some myths. I'm hoping most of you will have looked at those myths and gone, well, yep, that's pretty self-explanatory. We've looked at some tips and tricks to consider and talked a little bit about some of the challenges around teaching First Nations content with confidence. And just a little bit on this image is actually a possum skin cloak that I worked on as part of a project with the university. So we now actually have a possum skin cloak as part of the School of Education at RMIT, which is very, very exciting. And so these are sorts of some of the things that you can think about if you want to engage with this sort of practice with your schools. And of course, if you have some budget as well, which of course is always the key part. So I suppose here's some references for you guys to have a look at. Some of them are very practical. Some of them are quite very much for a sort of an abstract engagement, and some of them provide some really good historical context. So I'd recommend that. And of course, we've got the Victorian Aboriginal Education Association. They're a fantastic organisation that can help. We've got the Marang Plan, which is about Aboriginal education in Victoria. And of course, we've got the protocols for career engagement as well to support teachers and schools if they want to engage with community as part of that practice. And that pretty much brings me to the end of the half an hour. And the next part is going to be some Q&A, which one of my colleagues is going to help facilitate. So on that note, I just want to thank you all so much for joining me as part of the session. And I wish you all the best with your teaching of the content and especially with some of the challenges around going back to the classroom. So thank you very much.
I can't see.
Thanks very much, Al. Al is one of our series advisors and content consultants. So we've got the new titles in front and I'm hoping you can see them. A couple of questions come up, Al, that I'd love you to answer throughout the session. Firstly, what term would you use instead of settler?
Colonizer or invader. It depends on the context, really.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's something we've done. Oh, sorry.
There you go.
I was going to say that's something that we've done in the book chapter itself is removed all of the instances of settler and replace them with colonizer or invader, depending on what is the context around whether they were someone who is engaging in a violent act against Aboriginal and Torres Strait people or someone who was just sort of following them and taking the land.
Another question we had is, can we recommend some good websites? So I know you did that towards the end of your presentation there. I guess, you know, do you have anything else to add to that one?
Some really good websites to check out is an organisation called Australians Together. They've published a whole lot of one-page or two-page resources online, which are really, really cool. Of course, you've got the Melbourne Museum Bunjalaka exhibition. They have a fantastic website to engage with. Check out the Koori Heritage Trust. They're another really great organisation. And there's another website called Creative Spirits. But I do often have to caution my students that it's not a scholarly website because it's a bit like Wikipedia, but it definitely has a lot of really great links to other websites which are quite informative as well.
Very good. Lee asked a question. Where do you get the Momets book? I'm reading my own writing.
The which book, sorry?
It's a MEMMOTTS. Not sure. I might have to go back over the questions there and we'll get back to you, Lee.
Yes.
Kevin asked, where do we find evidence about the first scientists and first bakers? By definition, isn't learning through trial and error?
Well, I suppose, yeah, I suppose much learning is through trial and error, at least initially. A lot of the discussion around the food comes from history engaging with Aboriginal agriculture, and so a lot of that comes from Bruce Pascoe's work. In terms of the first astronomers and the first navigators, there's a whole lot of work being done with a couple of academics in New South Wales. I think it's either Sydney University of Technology or University of New South Wales. And they've got a big project looking at a whole lot of Aboriginal stories, dreaming stories that relate specifically to the stars. And what we also know is that when the first people arrived in Australia, they couldn't walk here because the sea level was already up. And so there was at least one point where there was a strait where they would have to cross by boat and they couldn't see the shore from the middle. And so, of course, that would require some level of navigation. So if you Google search Aboriginal people as first astronomers or Aboriginal people as first navigators, you'll find the websites and the academic papers which discuss that further.
Very good. Well, I think that's all for the questions, but I'd love to just have a 2-minute chat on what we've got on offer here. So Good Humanities has been a long time coming. It's been much anticipated, actually. We were due to come out with it last year and we've held off, and it's due out in July. So Year 7, you can see on your screen, is due out in July. Year 8 is in August and Year 9 is in October. All ready for student book list if anybody's interested. For any practicing teachers that have attended today, you'll get an email from me, and you'll be able to, secondary teachers I should say, you'll be able to select a book. There'll be one book per school going out to schools that attended, and we will have that out to you if you choose the Year 7 one in July. The new series is a flip book. It's a 7 to 9 series, and on one side of the book is history, the other side of the book is geography, and there's a how-to skills section in the centre of that, in the centre of the book. It's very much been curated on clear and accessible language, so you won't find that it's too wordy, quite the opposite. In fact, very accessible for all different learning styles. And there's something quite different you'll see in the samples that we send out in our learning ladder, and this is very much a skills-based book. So does anybody have any questions with regards to the books that we've got coming out? Well, thank you very much, Elle. Elle's been our series advisor and content consultant. So we'd like to thank you very much for putting this presentation together for us today. No doubt we'll be running some more in the future. And if any teachers have any suggestions on what they'd like to hear about, please send me an email or send your contact an email, and we will collate those responses and come back to you with some more sessions. So thank you very much for attending, everybody, today, and have a good evening.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.